She was nobody. A plus-size catering worker in a borrowed uniform standing at the edge of Chicago's most glamorous ballroom. And they destroyed her for it, publicly, laughing, recording it on their phones like it was entertainment. But what those people didn't know, what nobody in that glittering champagne-soaked room understood, was that the woman they were humiliating had accidentally memorized the financial records that could bring down half of Chicago's power structure. And the most dangerous man in the city had just walked through the door. If you've ever been underestimated, stay until the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The uniform didn't fit right. It pulled across the shoulders and the waistband dug into her hips in a way that made every shift feel like an argument she was losing. Amara Brooks had pinned the back seam twice already that evening, using safety pins she'd borrowed from the supply closet. And still, by 9 o'clock, she could feel it coming undone again with every step she took between the kitchen and the ballroom floor. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that a lot of things didn't matter these days. The Harrington Grand Ballroom was the kind of place that made regular people feel like they'd wandered into a movie by mistake. 40-foot ceilings with chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses. White linen tablecloths ironed so crisp they could cut skin. A live orchestra tucked into the corner, playing the sort of music that nobody actually listened to, but everyone pretended to appreciate. The charity was something about children's hospitals. Amara hadn't paid much attention to the briefing. She was focused on keeping her tray level, keeping her eyes forward, and making it through 8 hours without anybody noticing she was struggling. That was the job now. That was what her life had become. 14 months ago, she'd had an office. A real one, with her name on the door placard and a coffee maker that she'd bought herself and a window that looked out over the river. She'd been a forensic accountant at Kellerman and Associates. Good at it, genuinely good. The kind of good that made senior partners nervous because she caught things other people missed. She'd built that career from nothing, from a state school scholarship and 4 years of eating ramen, 3 nights a week and studying until 2 in the morning in a library that smelled like mildew and ambition. Then came the restructuring. The kind of corporate language that meant layoffs without the dignity of saying so out loud. They called it a workforce realignment. They gave her a box and a severance package and a handshake from HR, and then nothing. Nothing for 11 months while she sent out resumes into a void that never answered back. The catering gig was supposed to be temporary. That was in April. It was now October. She carried the champagne flutes across the ballroom floor with practiced efficiency, weaving between guests who moved like they had never once worried about anything. Men in tuxedos that cost $5,000. Women in gowns that cost more. Amara had learned to move like furniture, invisible. Present only long enough to fill a glass or remove a plate, then gone again before anyone registered she existed. She almost made it through the night. The collision happened near the east side of the ballroom, beside a cluster of women who were laughing too loudly at something that wasn't that funny. Amara was carrying an empty tray back to the kitchen, head slightly down, watching her footing on the polished marble floor, when a woman stepped backward without looking, quick and sharp. The way rich people moved through spaces they assumed were cleared for them. The woman's champagne sloshed. The edge of her silk gown, deep emerald and clearly custom, caught the lip of Amara's tray, and for one terrible half-second, nothing happened. Then the champagne glass tipped. 2 or 3 drops landed on the hem, maybe a teaspoon of liquid, total. On a gown that color, it barely showed. What happened next had nothing to do with the dress. "Excuse me." The woman turned, and Amara watched her eyes travel, slowly, deliberately, from Amara's face down and then back up again. There was a pause. The kind of pause that meant something was being calculated. "Watch where you're going." "I'm so sorry," Amara said. She meant it. "I didn't see you step back." "Obviously you didn't see me." The woman's voice carried. It was designed to carry. "You don't see much of anything, do you?" The laughter from the group beside her shifted pitch. It became something sharper, more attentive. 3 women turned to watch, then 4, then a couple nearby. The ballroom didn't stop entirely, but the local temperature changed in the way it does when people sense blood in the water. "Gwendolyn, what happened?" one of them asked. "This woman." And the way she said woman made it mean something uglier. "Knocked into me, just barreled right through." She looked at Amara again with something that wasn't quite disgust but wanted to be. How does a catering company even allow this? Don't they have standards? I barely touched you, Amara said quietly. She was still calm. She'd been calm like this before, in situations like this, and she'd learned that calm was the only armor worth wearing. Your dress is fine. There's nothing on it. There's something on it. I can feel it. With respect, ma'am. Don't. Gwendolyn held up one hand. The rings on it could have paid Amara's rent for 3 months. Don't talk to me about respect. You people always want respect you haven't earned. The silence that followed that sentence was the worst kind. The kind that was also an invitation. A man somewhere behind Amara laughed. Not a mean laugh yet, just a laugh. But it opened a door. Someone else made a comment she couldn't quite hear. Then a voice she could hear clearly. Male, confident, the voice of a man who had never been uncertain about his place in any room, said, maybe next time they should hire staff that can actually navigate a ballroom without taking up the whole floor. There it was. Amara felt it hit her the way a fist lands. Not the pain right away, but the shock of impact. Her face went still in a way she recognized. The way it went still when something hurt badly enough that feeling it immediately would be dangerous. She looked at the floor for 1 second. Just one. Then she looked back up. I apologize for any inconvenience, she said. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that later, that her voice didn't shake. I'll let the floor manager know. You'll let security know, Gwendolyn interrupted. This is unacceptable. I come to these events to raise money for sick children, and instead I have to deal with... She gestured at Amara with one ring-heavy hand, a gesture that was somehow more insulting than words. This. Phones were coming out. Amara registered this with a kind of numb horror that she would understand better later. Not the cruelty of the moment so much as the willingness of people to document it, to frame it, to make entertainment out of someone's worst moment on a Friday night because they were bored and had champagne and felt safely above consequences. Someone said something about her weight. She heard it clearly and then immediately tried to unhear it. Someone else responded to that someone, and then there were 2 or 3 conversations happening simultaneously, all of them about her, all of them loud enough to be heard over the orchestra that had, she noticed distantly, begun to slow its tempo. 20 seconds, 30. The ballroom was contracting around her and expanding at the same time. She was sweating through the back of the ill-fitting uniform, and the safety pins were coming undone again, and the tray in her hands felt like it weighed 200 pounds. And she was absolutely not going to cry in front of these people. She was not going to do that. She had made herself that promise on the way to work tonight, and she was going to keep it. The music stopped, not faded. Stopped. As in the orchestra simply ceased to play, mid-measure, as if someone had cut a wire. The ballroom doors at the far end, the main entrance, the grand double doors that guests used on arrival, opened. They didn't burst open. They didn't bang against the walls. They simply opened, controlled and deliberate, and 4 men walked through first, and then a 5th man followed behind them, and every single person in that ballroom went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with good manners. Amara had never seen Dominic DeLuca in person before. She knew the name the way everyone in Chicago knew the name, from newspaper articles that were careful with their language, from rumors passed between co-workers, from the specific tone people used when talking about certain parts of the city at certain times of night. She knew the name the way you know a weather system, as a fact about the environment rather than a person. In person, he was not what she would have expected if she'd ever spent time expecting anything. He wasn't physically enormous. He wasn't theatrical. He wore a dark suit that fit the way expensive suits fit people who were actually measured for them. And he moved with the particular economy of someone who has never once had to rush because the room always waited for him. He was, she guessed, somewhere in his mid-40s. With dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that was handsome in the way a well-maintained tool is handsome, functional, precise, without unnecessary decoration. He walked 3 steps into the ballroom and then he stopped. He was looking at her. Amara became aware of this gradually, the way you become aware of a spotlight. Not all at once, but in stages. Warmth first, then brightness, then the disorienting recognition that you are the thing being illuminated. She was standing in the middle of a sea of people who had just humiliated her, holding an empty tray, with safety pins coming out of the back of her uniform. And the most dangerous man in Chicago was looking directly at her with an expression she could not immediately name. He crossed the ballroom floor, not quickly, but steadily, without deviation, without acknowledging the dozens of people who opened a path for him, or the way every conversation had not just paused, but dissolved entirely. He walked to her the way someone walks to a destination they've already decided on, and when he reached her, he was close enough that she could see the small white scar above his left eyebrow and the fact that he smelled like something clean and quiet, cedar and cold air. He took off his jacket. He did it without ceremony, shrugged it off his shoulders, held it for one moment, and then draped it over hers. The lining was warm and the jacket was heavy, in the way very good tailoring is heavy, and it covered the safety pins and the wrong-fitting uniform and everything she'd been trying to hide all night. And Amara Brooks stood very still and tried to understand what was happening. Then he turned to face the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Who started it? That was all he said. 3 words, quiet enough that people near the back had to lean slightly forward to hear, and yet the silence was so complete that they did. Nobody answered. For perhaps 5 seconds, nobody answered, and then the man Amara had heard making the comment about the floor, the confident one, the one with the voice of someone who had never been uncertain, said something. She didn't hear what exactly, because her ears were ringing slightly, but she saw the expression on Dominic DeLuca's face shift, and that shift was enough to make the man stop mid-sentence. "Say it again," Dominic said, still quiet, still absolutely calm. "I want to make sure I heard you correctly." The man said nothing. "That's what I thought." Dominic reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the jacket that was currently around Amara's shoulders, and produced his phone. He looked at it briefly, then put it away. He turned to Amara, and when he looked at her this time, his expression was different. Not softer exactly, but more direct, more present, as if she were the only other actual person in the room. "Are you hurt?" he asked. It was such a simple question. She hadn't expected it. "No," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat. "No, I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I said I'm fine." Something moved across his face. Not amusement, but close to it. "Okay." He turned back to the room, and when he spoke again, it was to a specific person. One of the bodyguards, she thought, standing near the door. And what he said was a quiet sequence of words she couldn't quite make out. The bodyguard nodded and stepped outside, pulling out his own phone. Around them, people were still not moving. Glasses of champagne were being held without being drunk. The orchestra sat with their instruments in their laps. The businessman who had spoken was now looking at Dominic with an expression Amara would later describe as someone realizing they'd made an error they couldn't immediately calculate the full cost of. Gwendolyn, the socialite, the green gown, the too many rings, had gone pale under her makeup. "My jacket," Dominic said to Amara, not to the room. "It's yours for the night. You can return it whenever you like." A pause. "Or don't." She should have said something practical. She should have handed it back and explained she was working and needed to speak to the floor manager. That was what a sensible person did. Instead, she said, "Why?" He looked at her for a moment before answering. "Because you were standing in the middle of a room full of people and not one of them was standing with you." She had no answer for that. She didn't think there was one. The jacket stayed on her shoulders. The ballroom remained quiet around them. This strange, suspended quiet of 100 powerful people who had just collectively understood that the woman they had spent the last several minutes destroying was, apparently, important to someone they were all afraid of, and they couldn't figure out how that math had happened or how to unhappen it. Amara would learn, much later, that Dominic had not been scheduled to attend the Harrington Gala at all that evening. He had arrived for a separate meeting with a political contact who had offices on the upper floor. He had heard the disruption from the hallway before the doors even opened. She would learn this later. Right now, she only knew that his jacket was warm, and the room was finally, blessedly silent, and for the first time in 14 months, she was standing in a crowd, and no one was laughing. Outside the ballroom, Dominic's man was already on the phone, and across the city, in a glass-walled office that overlooked Lake Michigan, a man named Victor Sorrenti poured himself a drink and watched a notification appear on his private monitor. A facial recognition ping from a private camera feed inside the Harrington Grand. 2 faces, side by side, Dominic DeLuca and Amara Brooks. Victor set his drink down very carefully. "That's a problem," he said to the empty room. Then he picked up his phone and made a call that would set the next 60 days of Amara Brooks's life on fire. The car was a black Escalade with tinted windows and leather seats that probably cost more than the entire catering operation Amara worked for. She sat in the back with her hands folded in her lap and Dominic DeLuca's jacket still around her shoulders, and tried to figure out at what exact moment she had lost control of the evening. She hadn't agreed to get in the car. Not exactly. After the ballroom went quiet, one of Dominic's men, tall, broad, with a face like a concrete wall, had appeared at her elbow and said quietly and without inflection, "Mr. DeLuca would like to offer you a ride." And she had looked at the ballroom full of people who were still watching her, and at the floor manager who had appeared from somewhere near the kitchen with an expression that made it very clear she was being fired in real time. And she had made a decision that was less a decision than an absence of better options. She'd gotten in the car. Now they were moving through Chicago's Friday night traffic, and Dominic was sitting on the far side of the back seat, looking at his phone, and nobody was talking. "Where are we going?" Amara said. "Somewhere quiet." He didn't look up from the phone. That's not an answer. He looked up then. Not annoyed, just present, focused on her the same way he'd focused on her in the ballroom, that same quality of attention that was uncomfortable because it felt genuine. "My property on North Sheridan. You'll have your own room, your own bathroom. Nobody will bother you tonight." "I don't need a place to stay. I have an apartment." "I know." She stared at him. "You know." "Wicker Park. 3rd floor. You've been there since March." He said it without apology, like a man reading from a report. "I had someone pull basic information when I came to find you in the ballroom. It's a precaution, not a threat. I make that distinction because it matters." Amara felt the hairs on her arms rise under his jacket. Not fear, exactly. Something more complicated than fear. The specific discomfort of realizing someone has known things about you without your knowledge, and not yet understanding what they intend to do with that knowledge. "You had someone pull my information in the 10 minutes between the ballroom and this car." 8 minutes. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to make you understand that I'm efficient. He put the phone away and looked out the window for a moment. The city slid past in streaks of gold and red. "I'm not going to hurt you, Ms. Brooks. If that had been my intention, I wouldn't have put my jacket on your shoulders in front of 200 witnesses. People with your kind of power don't need witnesses to worry about." A pause. He almost smiled, not quite, but the corner of his mouth moved. "You're not wrong about that." The car moved north, and Amara sat with her hands still folded in her lap and tried to slow her pulse down to something manageable. She was not a stupid woman. She understood the situation she was in, or at least the surface layer of it. She was in a car with a man whose name appeared in federal court documents she'd read once during a particularly slow afternoon at Kellerman and Associates, when a client file had crossed her desk that intersected briefly with a money laundering investigation that had ultimately gone nowhere. She remembered the name. She remembered a lot of things. That was the problem, though she didn't know it yet. The estate on North Sheridan was not what she expected, which meant she didn't entirely know what she'd expected, only that this wasn't it. It was large, set back from the road behind a stone wall that looked old and deliberate. But inside it was quiet in a way that expensive places sometimes were, and cheap places almost never were. The kind of quiet that came from good insulation and careful design, not absence. Staff moved through the corridors with the same practiced invisibility Amara had spent months trying to perfect in ballrooms across the city. And the small difference was that these people looked like they were doing it by choice. A woman named Carla showed her to a room on the 2nd floor. Clean, warm, with a window seat that looked out over a garden that was mostly dormant this time of year, but clearly magnificent in season. There were clothes already laid out. Not her size exactly, but close and nicer than anything she owned. "Mr. DeLuca keeps guest provisions," Carla said, without explaining further, and Amara decided not to ask. She stood in the room after Carla left and looked at the clothes and the window and the bed with its very white sheets and felt the specific flatness that comes after an adrenaline crash. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the jacket. She took it off finally and laid it across the armchair and looked at it. She'd been fired tonight. She was almost certain of that. The floor manager's expression had been unambiguous. She was in a stranger's house. She had $43 in her checking account and a student loan payment due in 9 days. Her best friend from college, Tanya, would tell her to call immediately and get out of there, and also simultaneously would want every detail. Her mother would tell her to pray. Her therapist, she hadn't been able to afford a therapist since April, would ask her how she was feeling, and Amara honestly didn't know. Exhausted. She was exhausted. And underneath the exhaustion, something that she hadn't felt in a long time, something she didn't immediately have a word for. She'd remember later that it was anger. Pure, undiluted, finally have permission to feel it anger. She slept harder than she had in months. Dominic was at the breakfast table when she came downstairs at 7:30 the next morning. He was reading an actual physical newspaper, which she hadn't expected, and drinking coffee from a mug that said nothing on it, which she found oddly reassuring. He was dressed casually, dark shirt, no jacket, and he looked, in the morning light, like a version of himself that was slightly less armored than the ballroom version. He looked up when she came in. "Coffee?" he said. "Please." She sat across from him and a staff member appeared with a cup before she'd fully settled into the chair. Dominic went back to his newspaper for 30 seconds, which she appreciated. It was the kind of social grace that cost nothing and indicated someone who understood how much space a person needed in the morning. "The floor manager at the event," she said, when she'd had enough coffee to form coherent sentences. "Feldman. He fired me." "I know. I'm assuming that's related to you being there." "Partially." Dominic folded the newspaper with the practiced neatness of someone who'd been doing it their whole life. "Feldman will be receiving a call this morning from the agency that contracts his events. He'll be informed that your termination was improper and that he'll be losing 3 major contracts if it stands. You'll receive a formal apology by noon." Amara set her coffee cup down, carefully. "I don't want you to do that. It's already done." "Then undo it." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because I don't know what that costs me," she said. "I don't know what anything you're doing costs me. And until I understand that, I don't want to be in debt to you for things I didn't ask for." The steadiness of his gaze didn't waver, but something in it shifted. A recalibration, maybe. He studied her for a moment in silence, and she held her ground under it, which was harder than it looked because this was a man whose attention had genuine weight to it. "Fair," he said finally. "That's it? Just fair? What else do you want me to say?" "I want you to explain why you walked across that ballroom last night. You don't know me. You had no reason." "I had a reason." "What reason?" He picked up his coffee, took a measured sip, set it down. "You were standing in a room where every person with money and power had chosen to make you smaller, and you weren't moving, you weren't running, you were just standing there, taking it, and your hands weren't even shaking." He looked at her directly. "I noticed things like that." The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, a bare tree moved in the October wind. "My hands were absolutely shaking," Amara said. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She didn't have an answer for that either. It seemed to be a pattern with this man. She spent the morning in the guest room making phone calls. The agency for a formal complaint? Her bank? Because she needed to know exactly what she was working with. Tanya, because Tanya would find out anyway, and it was better to control that conversation. Tanya said, "You are in the house of a mafia boss." 4 times in a row, each time louder. And Amara said, "I know." Each time more quietly, and eventually Tanya ran out of volume and said, "Okay, but what does he look like?" And that was when Amara knew the crisis portion of the call was over. By 2 in the afternoon, she'd received the formal apology from Feldman, which she read twice and then set aside. At 3, Dominic's man, the concrete wall one, whose name she learned was Marco, knocked on her door and said Mr. DeLuca was asking if she'd like to take a walk through the property. She went. Partly curiosity, partly because she was going stiff from sitting. The grounds in October were austere, but not bleak. A long garden path bordered by ornamental grasses gone to seed, a small reflecting pool with a thin skin of ice at the edges, stone benches placed at intervals. Dominic walked with his hands in his jacket pockets and spoke about the property the way people speak about things they genuinely like rather than things they own. The history of the stone wall, the horticulturist he'd hired 3 years ago, the fact that in May the path was lined with peonies. "You know about peonies," Amara said. My mother grew them. Badly. He almost smiled again, but more than almost this time. She killed them 2 years in a row and refused to accept that she'd done anything wrong. Did she ever get it right? Eventually, 3rd year, he paused at the reflecting pool, looked at the skim of ice. Most things take longer than they should. She knew he wasn't only talking about peonies. She decided not to say so. That evening, 3 things happened in quick succession that shifted the texture of everything. The first was a phone call Dominic took at dinner, which he handled by excusing himself briefly, stepping into the hallway, and returning 4 minutes later with a face that had closed down in the particular way faces close when news is being processed before it's shared. He didn't share it. He picked up his fork and resumed eating and asked Amara what she'd studied in college. And the conversation continued, but the closed-down quality of his expression didn't open back up for the rest of the evening. The second was a message Amara received from a number she didn't recognize. The text read, "Leave the DeLuca property tonight. Don't go back. This is not a threat. It is advice. You are not safe where you are." She stared at it for 60 seconds, then showed it to Marco when he passed her in the corridor, and Marco's face did something complicated and professional, which meant he took the phone without argument and disappeared. The third was that she dreamed that night about the Kellerman and Associates file, the one that had crossed her desk with the money laundering investigation 14 months ago, 3 weeks before she was let go. She hadn't thought about it in months, but something about the ballroom, something about the name Sorrenti, that she'd noticed on a framed photograph in Dominic's study, just noticed, peripherally, the way you notice things you don't know you're noticing, had apparently unlocked something in her memory's back rooms. She woke up at 3 in the morning with her heart pounding and sat up in the dark and thought, I've seen those numbers before. She didn't sleep again after that. By morning, Marco had confirmed the text message had come from a burner phone purchased 2 weeks ago in the South Loop. Dominic heard this across the breakfast table with the same measured stillness he applied to everything, but this time the stillness was tighter, denser, like pressure building in a sealed space. "Has anyone bothered you at your apartment?" he asked her. "In the past few months? Unusual cars parked outside, someone following you on the street, anything that seemed off?" Amara wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. Thought back. "There was a man outside my building in September. He was there 3 days in a row. I thought he was waiting for someone." "Describe him." She did. Dominic listened without interrupting and then, when she finished, took out his phone and sent a message to someone. He set the phone face down on the table and looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you react, because if you react in the middle, you're going to miss the part that matters." "That's an alarming way to start a sentence." "Yes," he said, "it is." He told her about Victor Sorrenti. He told her the way someone tells a thing they've been building toward. Not quickly, not with unnecessary drama, but completely. Laying out the facts in sequence the way a careful person lays out tools before beginning a job. Victor Sorrenti was the son of Paul Sorrenti, who had run the Eastern Chicago territories for 30 years and was now, at 71, mostly retired. Victor was 43 and had his own ambitions and his own network and an intelligence operation that was, Dominic said, without apparent ego, better than most people gave him credit for. 14 months ago, Dominic said, Victor had made a move to consolidate a political alliance with 3 city council members and 2 state legislators, all of whom had financial relationships with shell companies operating out of a Cayman account controlled by a holding company whose parent entity was headquartered in Luxembourg. The structure was complex and deliberately so, designed to survive any standard audit. Victor had spent 4 years building it. Amara's coffee went cold while she listened. 3 weeks before you were laid off from Kellerman, Dominic said, one of those shell companies retained your firm for routine bookkeeping verification on a real estate acquisition. It was a low-level file. It should have been handled by a junior associate. He paused. Instead, it came to you. She remembered. She remembered it clearly because it had come to her specifically. Rerouted from the junior associate who'd been assigned it, she'd been told it was a staffing error. She'd processed it in an afternoon, filed it, moved on. What I'm about to tell you, Dominic said quietly, is going to make you angry. You should let it. She said nothing, waited. You caught something in that file. You didn't know you caught it. You flagged an irregularity in the account numbers. Standard practice for you. Apparently, you put a note in the internal file. And then it went upstairs and someone at the senior partner level saw what you'd flagged and understood what it connected to. And instead of reporting it, they buried it. He looked at her steadily. And then they called the staffing agency and asked to have your contract quietly ended. The kitchen was very quiet. Victor found out you'd been the one to process the file, Dominic continued. He didn't know exactly what you'd seen, but he knew you had a photographic memory. Apparently it was mentioned in a performance review that made it into the wrong database, and he couldn't risk what you might remember or reconstruct. So he spent 6 months making sure you were unemployable, not threatening you, not approaching you, just systematically isolating you, making sure your references went cold, making sure you stayed small enough that nobody would take what you said seriously. He stopped talking. Amara sat with it. She thought about 11 months of silence from job applications. She thought about an interview at a downtown firm that had gone well, and then the call that never came. She thought about the reference from a former supervisor that had apparently been, tampered with? She thought about Gwendolyn and the green gown and the way the whole ballroom had pivoted so quickly, so seamlessly, as if it had been rehearsed. The gala, she said. Her voice was flat. Last night. Dominic nodded. It wasn't random. Gwendolyn Hart. Victor's been donating to her charitable foundation for 2 years. He gave her a specific target and a specific event and a very specific outcome in mind. Amara set the coffee mug down. Her hands weren't shaking. She was a little surprised to notice this. He wanted me destroyed publicly, she said, documented, so that if I ever came forward with anything about those accounts, there'd be videos of a catering worker having a breakdown at a charity event, Dominic said. Nobody would take you seriously. And you'd know that nobody would take you seriously, which meant you probably wouldn't try. The logic of it was pristine. That was the worst part. Not the cruelty of it, but the precision. The months of patience, the layers of it, the way it had been built to look like the world simply not being kind to someone, which the world did constantly, and to many people, and nobody questioned. How do you know all of this? She asked. Because Victor made a mistake 4 weeks ago, Dominic said. He moved on a business associate of mine without sufficient, he chose the word carefully, consideration. I started pulling threads. Your name appeared in 2 separate documents that weren't supposed to be connected. And you came to the gala because I came to the gala to meet a city council contact. I didn't know you'd be there. He looked at her directly. The rest of the evening was not planned. She believed him. She wasn't sure why. She had no particular evidence that this man told the truth about things. But she believed him in the specific way you believe something when your gut has better access to the full picture than your logic does. She stood up from the table, walked to the window. The garden outside was gray and still in the November morning light. I remember the accounts, she said. Her voice came out quiet and even. Behind her, she heard Dominic go very still. The account numbers from the file. I flagged the irregularity because 2 of the routing numbers used the same base structure as a series of accounts I'd audited 2 years before on a different case. I remember the sequence. She turned around. I didn't know what it meant then. I know more now. Dominic looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Something that was not quite surprise because he didn't seem like a man who surprised easily, but its more controlled cousin. Recalculation, rapid and thorough. Amara, he said. And it was the first time he'd used her name, and she noticed this. If what you're saying is accurate, I'm a forensic accountant. I don't make claims about financial data that aren't accurate. If what you're saying is accurate, then Victor Sorrenti doesn't just want to discredit you anymore. She already knew what was coming next. She'd known it from the moment she'd connected the sequence this morning at 3 a.m. in the dark. He'll want to make sure I can't talk at all, she said. Dominic stood up from the table. Then we have less time than I thought, he said, and he was already reaching for his phone, and the calm that he carried like a coat was still there. But underneath it now, something had shifted. Something operational, focused, cold, in the way cold can mean precise rather than cruel. Marco appeared in the kitchen doorway without being called, as if he'd been waiting. We need to move up the timeline, Dominic said to him. Marco said, How far? All of it. Today. And Amara stood at the kitchen window of a man she'd known for less than 24 hours, looking out at the frozen garden, while somewhere across the city, Victor Sorrenti was picking up his own phone and giving his own instructions to his own people. And the distance between those two phone calls was the only thing standing between her and a fate that had been decided for her months ago by men who had never once considered that she might remember every number she had ever read. She thought about the file. She thought about the account sequence. She thought about 14 months of silence and rejection and the safety pins in the back of a uniform that didn't fit. She thought about a ballroom full of people recording her humiliation on their phones like it was content, like she was content, like the worst moment of her life was something they could consume and discard. She thought, not anymore. Outside, the first car was already pulling around from the garage. The first car pulled around at 7:43 in the morning, and Amara watched it from the kitchen window with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold 10 minutes ago without her noticing. A second car followed. Then a third. Black, all of them, moving with the coordinated quiet of things that had been prepared long before this moment, which told her that Dominic's operation didn't scramble. It shifted, adjusted, redeployed. There was a difference between those things, and the difference mattered. Marco was on his radio in the hallway. She could hear fragments of it, names she didn't recognize, street designations, something about a warehouse on the west side that needed to be cleared before noon. Dominic was in his study with the door half open, and she could see him standing at his desk, not sitting, one hand flat on the surface and the other holding his phone to his ear. And he was speaking in a register too low to hear, but with a precision that made the air around him feel pressurized. She should have been afraid. She cataloged her emotional state with the same methodical instinct she applied to financial documents and found, not afraid. Not exactly. There was something present in her chest that was adjacent to fear, a high-tide aliveness, an awareness of her own pulse. But underneath it was the anger she'd identified the night before, and the anger was steady and clean and not going anywhere. She rinsed her mug, dried it, set it back on the counter because she'd been a guest in this house for less than a day, and old habits about leaving spaces the way you found them died harder than most things. Dominic appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:51. "We're moving you to a secondary location," he said. No preamble. "North Shore property, smaller, easier to secure. We'll be there by 9. "What happened?" He looked at her for a half second with the expression of someone deciding how much of a truth to give. "Victor moved faster than I expected. He has someone watching this property." "Since when?" "Since last night, we think. Since the gala." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, which she understood as a choice. He was making himself level with her, not standing over the conversation. "Which means he knows you're here. Which means this address is no longer safe." "Was he having me watched before the gala?" "Intermittently, yes." She processed this. So the text message last night, the burner phone, was either a warning from someone in his organization who has doubts about what Victor's planning, or it was bait to get you to leave the property alone. We don't know which yet. "What does your gut say?" A pause. Brief. "Bait." She nodded once. "Then we don't move because of it." He looked at her steadily. "We're moving because of the surveillance on this property, not the text." "Okay." She stood up. "How long do I have to pack?" "You didn't bring anything." She looked down at herself, but the borrowed clothes from last night, the guest room provisions. "Right. There are things at the other property," Carla called ahead. Of course she did. The drive north took 40 minutes through traffic that was building toward the morning's peak. Amara sat in the back of the second car with Marco in the front passenger seat, and a driver named Reeves who hadn't spoken once since she'd gotten in. The first car ran 10 minutes ahead of them. Dominic was in a third vehicle that she didn't see, but Marco assured her was in the convoy. She watched the city move past the window. Chicago in November was a particular shade of gray that she'd always found honest. It didn't pretend to be something warmer than it was. She'd lived here her whole life except for 4 years of college in Ohio, and she'd come back not because it was easy, but because it was hers. And now she was in an armored SUV in a criminal convoy, moving through her own city, and the city looked exactly the same as it always had, which was both comforting and obscene. "Marco," she said. He half-turned in the front seat. "The man who was outside my building in September. Did you find out who he was?" A beat. "We have a name. Is he Victor's?" Another beat, longer. He's connected to an intermediary who does work for the Sorrenti organization. Yes. So he was watching me in September. It appears so. She turned back to the window. September. 3 months ago, she'd had a job interview at Meridian Financial Group, a good one, with a partner who'd seemed genuinely interested, who'd asked sharp questions about her forensic work and taken notes. The call that never came. She'd followed up twice. Polite non-responses. She'd assumed it was her weight, her presentation, any of the dozen things she'd been trained to blame on herself before considering structural explanations. The Meridian interview, she said, not to Marco specifically, but to the car, to the gray city outside. In September, someone made a call. Marco said nothing, which was its own answer. The secondary property was a house rather than an estate, still substantially above anything Amara had ever lived in, but human-scaled, a 3-story craftsman on a tree-lined street 2 blocks from the lake. Inside it was spare and functional, the furniture chosen for durability rather than display. It felt like a place where actual work happened rather than a place designed to impress people. Dominic arrived 6 minutes after them and went directly into a back room that had been converted into something resembling a command center. Monitors, phones, a whiteboard with a map of Chicago divided into territorial zones she wasn't meant to fully understand and didn't try to. She caught a glimpse of it through the open door before Marco quietly redirected her toward the kitchen. She ate toast because her body told her to. Drank more coffee because the alternative was feeling everything at once. A woman she hadn't met before, say late 50s, economical movements, reading glasses on a chain, introduced herself as Helen and set a laptop on the kitchen table. Mr. DeLuca thought you might want to start reconstructing what you remember, Helen said. About the accounts. I'm here to document it. Amara looked at the laptop, looked at Helen. He didn't ask me, she said. Helen met her eyes without flinching. No. Amara sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled the laptop toward her. Fine, but I'm driving. She spent 2 hours working through the account sequences from memory, pulling the numbers up from wherever her brain stored things it had processed once and never been asked to retrieve again. It was not like remembering a list. It was more like reconstructing a physical space from the inside. She had to move through the file the way she'd moved through it originally, processing it sequentially, letting each data point surface in the order it had been encountered. Helen typed, asked occasional precise questions, made no editorial comments whatsoever, which Amara appreciated more than she could articulate. By 11 o'clock, she had reconstructed enough of the account structure to see the architecture of it. The layering, the jurisdictional hopping, the way certain accounts functioned as clearinghouses that received from multiple sources and distributed to a single endpoint that then fragmented again. It was sophisticated work. It had taken someone years to build, and it was, even viewed from the outside as a structure rather than a crime, impressive in the way that very precise things are impressive before you understand what they're for. She was staring at the screen, at the shape of it, when she heard voices raised in the back room. Not shouting. Dominic's voice never shouted. She was already understanding, but raised, elevated in the specific way that meant information had arrived that was not good. She heard Marco's voice respond, then a third voice she didn't recognize, then silence. Dominic appeared in the kitchen doorway 2 minutes later. Helen looked up from the laptop and then, reading his face, closed it and left the room without being asked. He sat down across from Amara. She waited. I need to tell you something, he said. Same opening as yesterday morning. She was beginning to understand it as a tell, the specific phrase he used when what followed was going to cost her something. Say it. Raymond Kellerman, he said. Your former employer. She went still. He didn't just bury the file because he was protecting a client, Dominic said. Kellerman and Associates has been handling clean money for the Sorrenti organization for 9 years. The real estate acquisition file that came to your desk was supposed to be processed by a specific associate who knew to flag nothing and pass everything. The routing error that sent it to you wasn't a staffing mistake. He paused. Someone in that office rerouted it to you deliberately. The kitchen was very quiet. Someone on the inside of Kellerman sent me that file, Amara said slowly. We believe so. We don't know who yet or why. It may have been someone trying to create a paper trail without directly exposing themselves. It may have been someone who trusted that your reputation for catching irregularities would do the work they didn't want to be caught doing. He looked at her carefully. What we know is that Kellerman discovered what happened within 48 hours. He identified you as the processor. He called Victor Sorrenti directly. She thought about Raymond Kellerman. 60 years old, silver hair, the kind of handshake that came with 2 decades of practiced sincerity. He'd given her a glowing reference when she'd been hired 5 years before her layoff. He'd told her, when the restructuring was announced, that it was nothing personal and that he'd make sure she landed well. She'd believed him. She'd sent him a thank you note. "The reference he gave me," she said. Dominic said nothing. "He gave me a reference. When I was applying to other firms after the layoff, I have emails." "We've seen the emails," Dominic said. "What you don't know is what he was saying verbally, off record, phone calls to hiring managers he had personal relationships with." She understood now why the Meridian interview had ended in silence, and the interview before that, and the one before that. There was a specific physical sensation that came with this understanding. Not dizziness exactly, more like the floor performing a slow, quiet rearrangement of its relationship to her feet. She had spent 11 months believing the world was simply not interested in her. She had applied that belief inward. She had let it reshape how she moved through spaces, how loudly she spoke, how much room she allowed herself to occupy. She had taken 14 months of systematic destruction and experienced it as personal inadequacy. "He was making calls," she said. Her voice was completely flat. "Multiple calls over the course of months." She pressed both palms flat on the table. The wood was cool and solid and real, while sending me encouraging emails. "Yes." She looked at the tabletop, then she looked up. "Who else?" she asked. "In the file. Who else was connected?" Dominic hesitated for the first time since she'd met him. Genuinely hesitated, which was different from the pauses he used for calibration. This was a different kind of pause, the kind where the information on the other side of it was something he'd calculated the cost of giving. "Tell me," she said. "Councilman Peter Drazen," he said. "He sits on the City Ethics Committee and has co-sponsored 3 separate pieces of financial transparency legislation in the last 4 years. His campaign finance records are immaculate. He's considered one of the cleaner members of city government." She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago knew the name. Drazen had been in the papers last spring for pushing back against a rezoning deal that had looked corrupt, and probably was. "He's in the account structure," she said. "He's not just in the structure." Dominic looked at her directly. "He's the endpoint. The accounts feed to a holding entity that Drazen controls through 3 intermediary layers. He's been receiving distributions for 6 years. The man who'd been on the news talking about transparency. She almost laughed. She felt it rise in her chest and suppressed it because if it came out, it would not sound like laughter. "Does he know Victor's the source?" "He knows enough to know he can't afford for the source to be exposed." She sat back in her chair, looked at the ceiling, brought her gaze back down. "So I have a mafia family, a corrupt partner at my former firm, and a city councilman who's publicly built his reputation on financial ethics, all of whom have a specific interest in making sure I never get to talk about what I saw in that file." That's accurate, and I'd spent the last year thinking my career was over because I was fat and overqualified. The sentence came out without premeditation. She heard it land in the room and felt something shift in her chest. Not breaking, not collapsing, but reorganizing, the way tectonic things reorganize when enough pressure has been applied long enough. Dominic didn't look away. He didn't offer a softening comment. He simply held the space she'd created with the sentence, which was the right thing to do, and she registered it. "What's our next move?" she asked. "I have people pulling documentation on the Kellerman connection and building a case file on Drazen's financial trail. It'll take 48 to 72 hours to have anything solid enough to—" His phone rang. He looked at it. His face did the thing it had done at dinner 2 nights ago. Closed down, processing, controlled. He answered. "Yes." Listened. 3 seconds. 5. "How many?" A pause. "Don't engage. Hold the perimeter." He hung up. He looked at Amara. "Victor's people are outside," he said. "Not a question, not a hedged assessment. A fact, delivered clean." "The secondary location," she said. "He knew. He knew within 2 hours of us arriving." Dominic stood. Which means someone in your operation told him." She said it before he finished the sentence and watched it land on him. Not the information itself, because she could see he'd already reached it, but the sound of it out loud, in the kitchen, between two people who had not known each other 4 days ago and were now the only people in this house they could be certain weren't reporting to a man who wanted her silenced. Marco appeared in his doorway. Dominic looked at him for 3 seconds without speaking. 3 seconds was a long time for that particular silence. Marco looked back at him without moving, without expression, without the slight forward lean of a man waiting to be given instructions. He simply stood there, in the doorway, with his hands at his sides. "How did he know we were moving to this location?" Dominic said. Marco said, "I don't know." "You coordinated the convoy?" "Yes." "You confirmed the address with the advance team?" "Yes." "Who else had the address before we left North Sheridan?" Marco's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. "The advance team, Reeves, Helen, and you. And me." A pause. "Boss, don't." Dominic's voice dropped in register rather than rising, which was somehow more frightening than shouting. "Don't say whatever you were about to say. I've known you for 11 years, and I need you to understand that the next 30 seconds are going to define the rest of your life, so I need you to think carefully before you speak." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Marco looked at Dominic, then for one brief second, his eyes moved to Amara. And in that glance, she saw something that she filed and stored with the same precision she applied to account sequences. It was not guilt. It was not fear. It was calculation, rapid, ongoing, the look of a man still running numbers rather than a man who'd already accepted what was coming. That told her everything she needed to know about how this had happened and why. "He has my sister," Marco said. His voice was flat and entirely steady, which was almost more disturbing than if it had shaken. "Victor has had my sister for 9 days. He said if I didn't..." He stopped. Started again. "He said she'd be returned unharmed if I kept him informed. He said it was temporary. He said..." "I don't care what he said." Dominic had gone very still, the kind of still that preceded something seismic. "Where is she?" "I don't know. He gave me a number to call, but I don't..." "Give me the number." Marco recited it from memory. Dominic gave it to someone on his phone in under 45 seconds. Then he looked back at Marco with an expression that was not anger, or not only anger, but grief, complicated and real, the expression of a man for whom betrayal was not abstract. "Sit down," Dominic said. Don't make a call. Don't move from this room." Marco sat down. He looked at the floor. The calculation was gone from his face now, replaced by something that was closer to collapse. The specific way a person looks when they've been holding something for 9 days and have finally been allowed, or forced, to put it down. Amara looked at him. She thought about a sister she'd never met, held somewhere by a man who had already spent 14 months systematically taking apart her life. She thought about the ways people got cornered into things, the ways Victor Sorrenti had spent years identifying precisely what each person valued most and using it as a lever. She didn't say any of this. Now was not the moment for it. Dominic came back into the kitchen. He was moving differently now, still controlled, but with a directional urgency that hadn't been there before, like a current that had been steady and was now accelerating. "We have 6 people outside and a property that's been compromised," he said. He was looking at Amara. "Victor isn't here to make a move yet. He's watching, establishing our position. We have a window. It's not a wide one." "What do you need from me?" "The account sequences you reconstructed this morning. How much of it is in the laptop?" "About 70%. The rest is here." She touched her temple. "If Victor gets you, the laptop doesn't matter. You understand that?" "I understand that." He looked at her for a moment with the full weight of that attention she'd been learning to read. "I'm going to get you out of this house. But where we go next and what we do when we get there is going to require you to make a decision about who you're willing to be on the other side of all of this." She looked at him steadily. "I've been making that decision for the last 2 days," she said. Outside, 3 cars were parked at staggered intervals on a tree-lined street 2 blocks from Lake Michigan, and the men inside them were waiting with the particular patience of people who had been told they could afford to wait because the woman inside the house had nowhere left to go. They were wrong about that, but the moment she would prove it to them was still 48 hours away, and between now and then someone was going to have to walk out the front door of a compromised safe house in broad Chicago daylight and trust that the man beside her had enough pieces in play to keep both of them alive long enough for her memory to finish what a routing error had accidentally started 14 months ago. She picked up the laptop, closed it, tucked it under her arm. "Let's go," she said. And somewhere across the city, in a location that not even Marco knew, a woman named Sofia Ricci sat in a locked room and listened to footsteps in the corridor outside, and did not yet know that the woman who was about to burn down her brother's employer had just decided quietly and completely that surviving was no longer enough, that what came next was going to be something else entirely, something that had no name yet but was already moving through her like weather. They went out the back, not through a tunnel or a hidden passage, nothing so theatrical. Just the back door into the service alley, Dominic in front and Amara directly behind him and two of his men flanking them, moving fast and low and quiet in the gray November morning. The laptop was still under Amara's arm. She'd refused to give it to anyone else. Nobody had argued with her about it. The alley smelled like wet concrete and old garbage, and something metallic underneath that she decided not to identify. Her borrowed shoes were half a size too small, and she could feel the left one starting to rub at the heel, but she focused on Dominic's back and matched his pace and did not think about the 3 cars parked 2 blocks away and the men inside them. They moved 40 yards down the alley before a black sedan pulled in from the far end. Not fast, controlled, deliberate, the same way everything in Dominic's operation moved. The driver was a woman Amara hadn't seen before, short hair, both hands visible on the wheel, engine already running. They got in. The car moved before the door was fully closed. "Victor's people are still watching the front," one of the flanking men said from the passenger seat. His name was Garrett, and he was younger than Marco by at least a decade, with the focused tension of someone who had not yet learned to carry danger quietly. "How long before they realize we're gone?" Dominic said. 20 minutes. Maybe less if they have someone on the alley." "Do they?" Garrett looked at his phone. "Not as of 4 minutes ago. 4 minutes is a long time." Nobody disagreed with that. Amara sat with the laptop on her knees and watched the city slide past and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her old therapist had taught her before she'd had to stop affording her old therapist. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips and in her throat and at the back of her jaw where she'd been clenching without realizing it. She consciously unclenched. Her molars ached. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere Victor doesn't have a file on," Dominic said. He was looking at his phone, typing. "A contact of mine, not connected to any of my regular operations. A contact you trust." He looked up at her briefly. "Trust is a sliding scale." "That's not comforting. It's honest." She turned back to the window. "Fine. Where does this contact fit on the sliding scale?" "High enough for today," he said, and went back to his phone. They drove for 22 minutes and ended up in a neighborhood she recognized. Pilsen, South Side, the kind of area that had been gentrifying in patches for a decade while the original community held the center of it together through sheer collective stubbornness. The car stopped in front of a building that looked like a former auto shop, the kind of place that had been converted into a studio or a gallery or something that didn't need a sign to announce itself. The roll-up door in the front was closed. There were no visible cameras, which she suspected was itself a choice, rather than an oversight. Inside was a man named Breckenridge, 50s, angular, with the kind of tan you got from outdoor work rather than leisure, wearing clothes that were clean but had seen years of utility. He shook Dominic's hand with the grip of someone who wasn't performing, and looked at Amara with a direct assessment that wasn't hostile, just evaluative. "This her?" he said to Dominic. "This is Amara Brooks," Dominic said. "She's the reason we're here." "I figured." Breckenridge looked at the laptop. "That what I think it is?" "Partial reconstruction," Amara said. 70%. "And the rest?" She tapped her temple again. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd already calculated. The space inside was larger than the exterior suggested. Cleared floor, exposed brick, a long table in the center with equipment on it that Amara recognized as network hardware, and some she didn't. 2 other people were present, both young, both the kind of focus that came from knowing exactly what they were doing and why it mattered. "We have a window," Breckenridge said, not asking. "How long?" "Victor will have the alley covered within the hour," Dominic said. "He'll work backward from there. By this afternoon, he'll have a grid. So 4 hours. Maybe 6 if he's cautious." "Victor isn't cautious. He's fast." 4 hours then." Breckenridge looked at Amara. "Can you finish the reconstruction in 4 hours?" She thought about the remaining 30%, the back half of the file, the distribution endpoints, the final routing sequences. She'd been moving through the file in order because that was how her memory worked, sequentially, architecturally. She'd need to move faster through the second half, push harder, hold more variables in active recall simultaneously. 3, she said. Give me 3 hours. Breckenridge almost smiled. Sit down. She sat, opened the laptop. And for 3 hours in a converted auto shop in Pilsen, while Dominic's men held the perimeter and Breckenridge's people set up a secure transmission protocol, and somewhere across the city, Victor Sorrenti ran an expanding search grid, Amara Brooks went back into the file. It was not like remembering. It was more physical than that. A specific cognitive exertion that felt like lifting, like pressing against something with the full weight of her concentration and holding it there, not letting it slip, keeping the numbers in their correct sequence while simultaneously building the architecture around them. The way you might reconstruct a building from its structural drawings while the building itself is no longer standing. Her temples ached. Her vision blurred twice and she blinked it clear. She drank water that someone put beside her without looking up. Numbers. Routing sequences. Shell company identifiers. The specific formatting of Cayman account designations that told you which bank family they originated from if you knew how to read the prefix structures. She knew how to read the prefix structures. She had known for years, had learned it in a conference room in downtown Chicago from a senior partner who was apparently also taking money from the people she was now trying to burn down, which was a thought she filed and refused to let destabilize her concentration. She worked. At the 2-hour mark, Dominic sat down beside her. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at what she'd built on the screen, the reconstructed ledger, the account tree, the notation she'd added to clarify the connection points. And he looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they recognize as significant without fully understanding its technical language. How much left? He said. An hour. Maybe less. She didn't look up. The final distribution layer is the cleanest part to reconstruct because the endpoint structure was the most distinctive. I've been working toward it. The endpoint that leads to Drayson. And 2 others I didn't identify this morning. She typed a sequence. There's a third account. I've been pulling it up from the structure around it. I almost have the identifier. A pause. Who's the third? He said. I don't know yet. Give me 40 minutes. He gave her 40 minutes. He spent them on his phone and in low conversations with Breckenridge and Garrett, and once he walked the perimeter of the building and came back with his jaw set in a way that told her the grid was tightening faster than they'd hoped. She registered this and kept working. At the 2-hour 40-minute mark, she stopped typing. She sat back in the chair. She looked at the screen. Dominic, she said. He was across the room. He was beside her in 8 steps. She turned the laptop so he could see the screen. Specifically the third account identifier and the corporate registration she'd traced it to through the prefix structure and her memory of a regulatory filing she'd processed 3 years ago on an entirely different case, a filing that had crossed her desk for 2 hours and then been returned to archive and that she had never expected to think about again. He read it. She watched his face. His face did not close down this time. It did something different, a shift that was less controlled, more structural, like something foundational had been touched. You're certain, he said. The prefix structure matches a registration format I've seen once before. The distribution amounts and timing align with the account pattern. I'm certain. Thomas Carver, he said. Not a question. Reading it off the screen. Deputy Director of the Illinois Financial Crimes Unit, she said. The man whose office would normally receive this kind of evidence. She paused. The man whose office has apparently been protecting it for 6 years. The room was quiet. Breckenridge had appeared at Dominic's shoulder, reading the screen. He let out a breath that was not quite a word. So there's no one to send this to, Garrett said from across the room, and his voice was young and tight and not entirely steady. There's Federal, Dominic said. Federal takes time, Breckenridge said. Victor's grid takes hours. Then we make the time work. Dominic straightened. He looked at Amara directly. Can you transmit this now? The full reconstruction. If Breckenridge's protocol is ready. Breckenridge was already moving back to the long table. It's ready. Has been. Who are you sending it to? She asked Dominic. 2 federal contacts. One journalist I trust, which means she's verified 3 separate stories that could have destroyed powerful people and published all 3. And a financial regulator at the federal level who has been trying to build a case on Sorrenti-connected accounts for 4 years without enough source material to file. He looked at her. 4 separate recipients. Victor can't suppress all of them simultaneously. He'll try. He'll fail. She looked at him for a moment. In the fluorescent light of the converted auto shop, he looked like what he was, a man who had spent decades operating in spaces most people never saw, who carried the weight of choices that didn't have clean answers, whose hands were not clean and knew it, and had decided that what he did with what he knew was what would define the end of the story rather than the beginning. She was not naive about what he was. She had not been naive about it from the first night. She turned back to the screen and began the transmission sequence. They were 12 minutes into the upload when the building's exterior alarm tripped. Not a loud alarm, a silent notification on Breckenridge's phone and then on Garrett's. They exchanged a look. Garrett went to the window along the east wall and looked through the edge of the covered glass and came back in 4 seconds. 2 vehicles, he said, south side of the block. They're not police. The transmission was at 31%. How did he find us? Amara said. He didn't find the building, Breckenridge said, looking at his phone, reading something. He found the transmission. We're pinging a server and he has someone monitoring for that signature. He looked at Dominic. Someone good. Can we reroute? Yes, it'll pause the upload for 90 seconds. Do it. Breckenridge moved. The upload bar stopped. Amara watched it and breathed through her nose and did not let her hands move toward the keyboard because there was nothing useful for her hands to do right now, and she needed them steady for when there was. 31%. 31% held everything through the Kellerman connection and the first 2 distribution layers. It held Drayson. It did not yet hold Carver, and Carver was the fulcrum, the piece that explained how the financial crimes apparatus had stayed clean in the public eye for 6 years while the crime ran beneath it. We need Carver to transmit, she said. We need the upload to resume first, Breckenridge said, fingers moving. 20 seconds. Outside, something moved. She didn't hear it so much as feel it, a change in the quality of the silence. The way silence changes when it starts containing things that haven't announced themselves yet. Garrett felt it too. He moved away from the window and checked the firearm at his hip with the reflexive economy of long practice. The upload bar moved, 32%. The front roll-up door took a hit from something. Not a battering ram, more targeted, the sound of an industrial lock being defeated with specific tools. The door held, but it had maybe 90 seconds left, if that. Back exit, Dominic said. Not loud. Everyone heard it. The upload, Amara started. Leave the laptop. The laptop has the reconstruction. If we leave it, the transmission is running. It doesn't need the laptop to finish. She looked at the upload bar. 41%. 41% was not enough. 41% had Drayson, but not Carver. Without Carver, the Financial Crimes Unit could receive this evidence and bury it at the departmental level, and nobody outside the unit would know it had ever existed. I'm not leaving, she said. Dominic looked at her. The roll-up door took another hit. Amara, I'm not leaving this building until that upload hits Carver's account records. She turned back to the screen. 53%. That's the piece that makes everything else irretrievable. Without it, he has room to maneuver. With it, he doesn't. You know that. A beat. 2. Breckenridge, Dominic said. I'm on it, Breckenridge said, and she didn't know what that meant, but something in his voice said it was the right answer. Garrett and the other man moved toward the front of the building, placing themselves between the door and the room's interior with the deliberate positioning of people who had done this before and understood the geometry of it. Dominic stayed beside Amara. She didn't look up at him. She watched the upload bar and breathed and heard the door give its third impact, and then a sound of metal under serious stress. And then Garrett's voice, very flat, very controlled, saying, "Here we go," to nobody in particular. The door came in at 67%. They came through fast, 4 of them, then 2 more behind, moving in a practice spread that cleared the entrance and fanned into the space. Professional. Not police, but trying to look like something adjacent to professional, which was its own kind of information. Victor had money. Victor had resources. Victor had had 6 years to build an arm in operation while Amara Brooks had been in an office on the 15th floor, flagging account numbers and thinking she was doing routine work, 68%. The first man threw locked eyes on Amara and the laptop. She was the target, that was clear. The laptop was secondary, but also a target. And he started moving toward her, and Garrett stepped into his path, and things became extremely loud and extremely fast. She kept her eyes on the screen. This was, she understood in some calm and separate part of her brain, insane. She was sitting at a table in a firefight watching an upload bar. She was doing this because she had spent 14 months being made smaller and quieter and less credible by people who needed her to not exist in any meaningful way, and she had spent 3 hours rebuilding from memory the exact evidence that would make their needs irrelevant, and she was not walking away from it at 68%, 72. Dominic was beside her, not moving toward the conflict near the door, but also not leaving. She registered this without looking at him. She felt it more than saw it. His presence beside her, this man who had walked across a ballroom and put a jacket on her shoulders, and then proceeded to be in every interaction she'd had with him since exactly what he appeared to be, which was in her experience a vanishingly rare quality in any human being and a statistically improbable one in this specific subset of human beings. 78. A man reached the table, not one of the original 4. He'd come around the flank, fast, using the chaos near the door as coverage. He was big, bigger than Garrett, and he got a hand on the laptop and started pulling before Amara's other hand came down on his wrist. She had strong hands. 14 months of catering work, carrying trays, lifting, moving equipment between events. Her hands were stronger than they'd ever been at a desk. She pressed down with everything she had and looked the man directly in the face and said, with complete evenness, "Don't." He looked at her. He was surprised. She could see it, the specific surprise of a man who'd expected to take a thing from a woman and encountered resistance where he'd calculated none. He recovered fast and used his other hand, and she lost the grip on his wrist, but kept her own hand on the laptop's edge, both of them holding it now, pulling in opposite directions. And then Dominic's hand came down on the man's shoulder and redirected him in a way that was brief and efficient and resulted in the man on the floor and Dominic standing over the table breathing hard for the first time since she'd met him. 89. "Come on," she said to the screen, out loud. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. 93. The noise near the door had changed character, less immediate, more settled, which she chose to interpret as favorable without looking. She could smell gunpowder and something chemical, and the copper-adjacent smell of something she categorized and moved away from. 97. She became aware that she was gripping the edge of the table with both hands, and that her knuckles were white, and that somewhere in the last 5 minutes she had bitten the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste blood, which she had not noticed until right now. 99. The upload bar went to 100% at 10:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in November in a converted auto shop in Pilsen, and for a half second the building was completely silent except for the sound of people breathing. Then Breckenridge said, from across the room, "It's confirmed. All 4 recipients. Federal servers logged it at 10:47. She let go of the table. Her hands were shaking now. She noticed this with detachment. They hadn't shaken through the 3 hours of reconstruction, hadn't shaken when the door came in, but they were shaking now. Post-event, the body demanding its moment. She looked at the screen. The confirmation receipt was there. Time-stamped, server verified, irretrievable. 4 simultaneous recipients, the journalist, the federal contacts, the financial regulator who'd been trying for 4 years. And somewhere in a glass-walled office overlooking Lake Michigan, a notification was about to appear on a private monitor that Victor Sorrenti had not anticipated and could not suppress. She became aware of Dominic standing very close to her and turned to look at him. His jacket was askew and there was a cut above his left eyebrow. Not the old scar, a new one, bleeding in the thin, persistent way cuts on foreheads bled. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, unguarded, uncontrolled, something that had gotten through whatever he normally used to keep things from showing. "It went through," she said. "I heard." "All 4. I heard, Amara." She nodded, looked at her shaking hands, pressed them flat on the table, looked back up. "Victor," she said. Dominic's expression shifted back towards something operational. "He's going to know within the hour. His contacts at the Financial Crimes Unit will tell him. He'll know the transmission went through, he'll know what it contained, and he'll know he can't walk it back." He paused, "which makes the next 6 hours the most dangerous of this whole situation. Because he has nothing left to lose." "Because he has nothing left to lose," Dominic confirmed. Across the building, Garrett was on his radio. Breckenridge was wiping down the equipment with the focused calm of a man who had already planned for what came next. The two people on the floor, Victor's men, were zip-tied and conscious and silent. Outside the building, a phone rang in one of the two vehicles parked on the south side of the block. The man who answered it listened for 4 seconds, then said 3 words into the phone that Garrett, watching from the doorway, could not hear. But he could read the man's face through the windshield. He'd seen that face before. Not on this man specifically, but on the particular configuration of features that meant someone had just received news that changed the nature of everything they'd been sent here to do. He went back inside and said, "They know." And Victor Sorrenti, in his glass-walled office with the lake view, set down the phone he'd just received the transmission confirmation on, and looked out at the gray November water, and understood that the woman he had spent 14 months making invisible had just made him seen by every person with federal authority in the state of Illinois, and that the only move he had left was the most desperate one. And he was already picking up his second phone to make the call that would force the final confrontation that everyone had been moving toward, since a woman in an ill-fitting uniform had accidentally brushed against an emerald gown in the Harrington Grand Ballroom on a Friday night in October. His second call lasted 45 seconds. When it ended, a door opened in a building 3 miles south of Pilsen, and Sophia Ricci, Marco's sister, 9 days captive, exhausted and frightened and not yet broken, heard footsteps approaching her room that were different from the footsteps she'd been listening to for 9 days, heavier, more purposeful, and understood with the specific animal clarity of someone who has been afraid long enough to get very good at reading danger that something had changed, and not in the direction she'd been hoping for. The footsteps stopped outside her door. The footsteps stopped. Then they moved away. Sophia Ricci sat in the dark with her back against the wall and her knees drawn to her chest and listened to them recede down the corridor, and she did not yet know why, but she understood in the way the body understands things before the mind catches up that the nature of her captivity had just changed. Something had shifted in the architecture of power around her. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. Not the thing itself yet, but its approach. She had been in this room for 9 days. She had learned to measure time by the sounds of the building, the shift changes, the meals, the periodic checking of the lock on her door. She had learned to read the emotional temperature of her captors through the walls, through the quality of their silences, and the pace of their footsteps. And what she was reading now was not routine. It was something that moved faster, with a different kind of weight. She pressed herself smaller against the wall and waited. 23 minutes later, the building's fire exit on the ground floor, 2 levels below her room, was taken off its hinges without noise by 2 people who had been trained for exactly this kind of entry and who had the building's structural schematics on a tablet and Sophia's room location confirmed from a source that had cost Marco Ricci everything he'd had left to give. She didn't hear them until they were outside her door. "Sophia Ricci," a woman's voice, controlled, professional. "Federal Task Force, we're getting you out." Sophia pressed her palm against the door. The wood was solid and cold. "How do I know?" A pause. Then the same voice. "Your brother says you owe him dinner. His words exactly." She closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she moved away from the wall and tried to remember how to stand at full height. The door came open. 3 miles north, in the converted auto shop in Pilsen, Amara's phone rang at 11:22. The number was Dominic's. She answered it even though he was standing 8 feet away from her, because he'd stepped outside to take a call 2 minutes ago, and something in the way he'd stepped outside told her to let him control the pace of whatever was coming. "Sophia's out," he said through the phone. His voice was even. Unharmed. She let out a breath she'd been holding, she realized, for several hours, possibly since yesterday morning. Okay, he said, and hung up, and came back inside. He didn't announce it to the room. He met Amara's eyes, and she gave him a small nod, and he gave her one back, and Breckenridge, who was watching both of them from across the room, turned back to his equipment without comment. The next 4 hours were the specific kind of chaos that looked, from inside it, like waiting. Federal agents moved on the two shell company headquarters tied to the account structures Amara had reconstructed, both of which were located in office buildings in the Loop that would have passed for ordinary financial services firms if you didn't know what to look for in the filing cabinets. The journalist, her name was Priya Anand, and she'd been building the Sorrenti financial story from its public edges for 2 years without enough source material to publish, had the full transmission on her secure server before noon, and was on the phone with her legal team before 12:30. The financial regulator, a woman named Castellano, who had 4 years of frustrated dead ends behind her, and was, by all accounts, not a person who moves slowly when given something to move on, had a federal judge on the phone by 1 o'clock. Thomas Carver, deputy director of the Illinois Financial Crimes Unit, became aware that his name was in the transmission at approximately 12:45 from a junior agent who brought him the notification with the specific combination of confusion and gravity that meant she didn't yet understand what she was holding. Carver read it, set it down, picked up his desk phone, put it back down, looked out his office window at the Chicago skyline for approximately 90 seconds. Then he called his personal attorney, which was the moment his career ended, because the call was logged and the log was accessed within the hour. None of this happened where Amara could see it. She heard pieces of it through Breckenridge and through Dominic's phone calls and through the brief, factual updates that Garrett relayed from his own sources. She was sitting at the same table, on the same chair, with the laptop closed in front of her, and she was very tired in a way that went past the physical into something structural. The exhaustion of a person who has been operating at the outermost edge of what they can sustain and has now, suddenly, been told they can stop. She didn't know how to stop yet. She sat and waited and tried to locate the person she'd been before all of this, and found that she couldn't quite do it, which didn't feel as frightening as it probably should have. Victor Sorrenti was arrested at 2:47 in the afternoon at a private airstrip in DuPage County, 20 minutes before a chartered flight was scheduled to depart for Montreal. He had 1 carry-on bag and 2 phones and the specific expression of a man who had run the numbers and found them coming up wrong and had kept running them anyway because the alternative was to stop. And stopping was the one thing men like Victor Sorrenti did not know how to do. Amara learned about the arrest from Dominic at 3:15. He sat down across from her at the table, 2 cups of coffee between them, and told her simply and completely and without editorializing. She listened, nodded once when he finished. "Kellerman," she said, "his attorney is already cooperating. The forensic teams hit the firm's files this morning. It's extensive." Dominic held his coffee cup, didn't drink. "He's not getting out from under it." "Carver, suspended pending investigation. He'll be indicted within the month." A pause. "The Financial Crimes Unit is being restructured from the federal level. Castellano's office is taking point." "Councilman Drayson?" "Press conference at 4 o'clock where he was planning to announce his Senate campaign," Dominic said. "He's been informed that the press conference will instead be the occasion of his arrest. His communications team doesn't know this yet." Amara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, thought about Peter Drayson on the news last spring, talking earnestly about transparency and accountability and the public trust. Thought about the way people built their public faces to be the exact opposite of what they were doing in the dark, and how long that could work, and what it cost the people who got in the way of it. "Gwendolyn Hart," she said. "She'll be called as a witness. She has criminal exposure for her role in the organized harassment, but Victor's the primary. She'll cooperate to reduce it." Dominic looked at her steadily. "She's already asked, through her attorney, if there's a statement you'd like to receive." "From Gwendolyn Hart?" "Yes." Amara thought about the ballroom, the green gown, the rings, the way the laughter had moved through the room like something contagious, like something people caught from each other rather than chose. She thought about the phone's recording. She thought about standing with an empty tray and her safety pins coming undone and fighting with everything she had to not cry in front of 200 people who were documenting her worst moment for their own entertainment. "Tell her attorney that I don't need a statement," Amara said. "Tell her to use whatever she was going to spend on it to donate to a workforce reentry program. There are people who need that more than I need an apology from her." Dominic looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression. The same thing that had moved there when she'd turned the laptop around and shown him Carver's name, that quality of being genuinely affected by something he hadn't anticipated. "Okay," he said. "That's it?" Just okay? The corner of his mouth moved. It seemed like the right answer. She almost smiled. It surprised her, the almost smile. She hadn't expected to find that reflex still functional. You use that a lot. It works a lot. She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside the building, the November afternoon was settling into its early dark, the sky going from gray to charcoal to something that wasn't quite black yet, the particular color of a city that never fully switched its lights off. What happens to Marco? She asked. The almost smile left his face. What replaced it was more complex. Not anger, past that now, into something more durable and more honest. He gave federal agents everything he had on Victor's operation. The location where Sophia was held, the names of the men who took her, the internal structure of Victor's network. It's substantial. A pause. He'll face charges for the information he passed to Victor's people. But with full cooperation and Sophia's testimony about the conditions of the coercion, his attorney thinks he'll see reduced sentencing. What do you think? Dominic was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone's radio crackled and went silent. I think I've known him for 11 years and he protected his sister the only way he could see to do it, and that Victor Sorrenti put him in an impossible position deliberately because that's what Victor did. Found the thing people couldn't sacrifice and used it as a lever. He set down his cup. I think being right about what Victor did to him doesn't mean I can pretend the last 9 days didn't happen. And I think Marco knows that. He's not asking me to pretend. Is he asking you for anything? No, Dominic said. He's not. She heard what that cost him to say. She didn't remark on it. They left the auto shop at 4 o'clock. The street outside was quiet, ordinary. A Pilsen afternoon with its murals and its bodegas and its children coming home from school, all of it proceeding with the complete indifference of the world to everything that had just been decided inside the building behind her. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the cold air and felt the specific dislocation of a person who has been inside a crisis so long that ordinary reality requires relearning. The black Escalade was at the curb. Reeves was driving. There was no Marco in the front passenger seat, and the absence of him was its own kind of presence. She got in. Dominic got in beside her. The door closed. The car moved. Where do I go now? She said. She didn't mean it geographically, or not only geographically. Dominic was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I have a legitimate financial consulting operation. It handles restructuring for businesses that have been damaged by organized crime involvement, companies that need to be rebuilt from the inside out, transparently, with clean books. It's real work, it's documented, it's fully above board. He looked at her. I've been trying to find the right person to run it for 2 years. She looked at him. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a career. There's a difference. You've known me for 4 days. I know your work, he said. I've seen 3 hours of it under conditions that would have broken most people. And I know your judgment, which is harder to assess than your technical skills, and more important. A pause. The answer doesn't have to be now. She looked out the window. The city was doing what it did in the early dark, coming alive in a different register, the lights asserting themselves against the November sky, the traffic thickening, the restaurants beginning to fill with people who'd had ordinary days and were now doing ordinary evening things. She thought about the office that had had her name on the placard. She thought about 11 months of silence. She thought about an ill-fitting uniform and $43 and a student loan payment and standing in the middle of a ballroom while 100 people pointed their phones at her. She thought about 3 hours in a Pilsen auto shop, pulling a financial architecture out of her own memory with a firefight going on behind her and the upload bar at 99%, and her hands on the edge of the table and not moving. I have conditions, she said. Dominic said nothing, waited. The salary is market rate for a senior forensic financial director. Not a favor, not a courtesy. Market rate, independently verified. If you can't tell me what the market rate is before I look it up, we're done talking. 140 to 160, depending on the caseload structure. She hadn't looked it up. He was right. Second condition, I have full authority over the case selection. You don't bring me a file and tell me it's clean if you have doubts. You bring me your doubts first. Agreed. Third, she paused. This one was different from the others, and she knew he would hear the difference. What happened at the Harrington? The people who were filmed. I want the videos gone. Dominic looked at her. Some of them have already been distributed. I know. I want the originals gone from the people who took them. I want it made clear that further distribution is unwise. She held his gaze. Not as revenge. I don't care about revenge. But those videos exist as evidence of what they did to me, and I don't want them to exist as entertainment for people who were never part of any of it. It's not the same as what happened in the ballroom. It's just mine. I want it back. A long pause. Done, he said. She nodded, looked back out the window. Those are my 3 conditions, she said. I'll have an answer by the end of the week. The car drove north through the darkening city, and neither of them spoke again for a while, which was comfortable in the specific way silence is comfortable between people who have been through something together and found out what the other one was made of. 3 weeks later, Chicago woke to headlines that ran above the fold on every major paper and led every local broadcast and generated, by Priya Anand's count, 47,000 social media shares in the first 6 hours. The language varied, but the substance didn't. The largest organized crime financial seizure in the city's history. Victor Sorrenti's organization dismantled. Councilman Drayson indicted. Deputy Director Carver suspended and facing federal charges. Raymond Kellerman of Kellerman and Associates cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentencing, a deal that would nevertheless cost him his license, his firm, and the better part of a decade. The anonymous source at the center of it, the person whose transmitted financial reconstruction had provided the foundational evidence for every thread of the investigation, was identified in Priya Anand's piece only as a forensic accountant with a photographic memory who had been systematically targeted for neutralization by the Sorrenti organization and had instead chosen to do the opposite of what they'd intended for her. The piece was 4,000 words. It ran on a Thursday. By Friday, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. Amara read it on her laptop in a new office, her office, with her name on the door placard, which she had insisted on personally, on the 14th floor of a building in the West Loop that housed Dominic's legitimate consulting operation. The office had a window that looked out over the city and a coffee maker she'd brought from her apartment in Wicker Park, which she still lived in because it was hers, and she'd decided she wasn't going to let 14 months of Victor Sorrenti's careful destruction take her neighborhood from her on top of everything else. She read the piece through to the end, set the laptop aside, looked out the window at the Chicago skyline in the late November morning. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to, and she didn't. What she felt was more complicated and more permanent than triumph, something that sat in the chest like ballast, like weight, that was not burden, but foundation. The feeling of being correctly located in her own life after a very long time of being somewhere adjacent to it. Her phone rang. Tanya. She answered. It's everywhere, Tanya said, without preamble. I know. You're the anonymous source. I'm an anonymous source. Amara. Tanya. A pause. Are you okay? She looked out the window. The city was gray and bright simultaneously in the way it got in late November. The sky flat and the buildings lit and the lake invisible from here but present, always present, that vast cold fact at the edge of everything. Yeah, she said. I think I actually am. The job? Starts Monday. The man? She almost laughed. It came out as something smaller but genuine. That's a longer conversation. I have time. I don't right now. I have a case file to review before noon. She paused. Can I call you tonight? I'll be up, Tanya said, and the warmth in her voice was the specific warmth of a person who had been worried for a long time and was beginning, carefully, to stop. She hung up, set the phone down, opened the case file on her desk. The first one, a restaurant group in Bridgeport that had been used as a cash laundering front for 3 years without the owner's knowledge and was now trying to disentangle itself from the legal exposure and rebuild clean books. She read the first page, made a note in the margin, read the second. There was a knock at the door. Come in. Dominic opened it, leaned in the frame, didn't enter. He was in his coat, as if he'd just arrived or was on his way out. He looked at her at her desk with the case file open and the coffee maker running and her name on the placard, and that quality came into his expression. The unguarded one. The one that had appeared in the Pilsen auto shop and hadn't entirely gone away. The Drayson sentencing hearing got moved to January, he said. I saw. Castellano's office sent the notification. You'll need to give a deposition. I know. He nodded, looked at the case file. Bridgeport Group? The restaurant owner genuinely didn't know, she said. I can see it in the account structure. The irregularities start in a branch account she didn't have regular access to. Someone used her business, and she had no idea. She looked up. She deserves to keep her restaurant. He looked at her for a moment. That's why I needed someone with judgment, he said. She looked back at the file. Close the door on your way out. He almost smiled. She could hear it even without looking up. Good morning, Ms. Brooks. Good morning. The door closed, softly, and she turned a page in the case file and made another note, and outside the window, Chicago went about the business of being itself. Complicated and gray and brilliant and brutal and, in the end, always still standing. And Amara Brooks sat in her office on the 14th floor and did the work. And the work was good, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was a thing she had not been able to say about herself in a very long time, and which she intended, from this point forward, not to take for granted. The coffee maker finished its cycle. The smell of it filled the room. She didn't look up from the file. She was already 3 pages in.